Within the events of dead space, into the deep void of the space around the Aegis cluster, a secretive ship known as the Observer-class vessel with the crew of 3 individuals, known as Stefan, Gavin, and Dennis, had been conducting experiments in space, and they would each complete surveys based on their individual experiences with these tests and experiments. What they had been experimenting on: long-distance travel without the use of a shock point drive, in an effort to see how deep space would impact the traveler in the dark. The day would be like any other, with the 3 crew members working on maintaining the ship and their experiments. However, for one of these men, they held a secret that would bring about the end of this mission, using the 2 as sacrificial lambs to the slaughter in order to secure a future for a loved one. Further and further along into the day, the ship would drift past the restricted sector line, moving closer to the planet of Aegis 7. The crew had been unaware of this breach of the law within the government. Dennis at this time had been relieved of duty, as he was to work the night shift as the others slept. It was his role to maintain the safety of the crew by directing the ship and looking out for any potential hazards in space that might challenge that perception of safety. Dennis would walk into the crew quarters, seeing the dartboard on the wall. He begins playing darts to relieve the pressure and tension of the following shift on his mind. Gavin at this time had been observing the surrounding planes of space, seeing the stars out in the vast beyond. He begins thinking of his daughter, thinking of what she and his wife would jokingly call him and his colleagues, the 3 spacemen. That's when he would remember a gift from his wife that she had given to him prior to this expedition, a picture of the 3 of them together. And he would remember the promise he had made to his daughter of the recording he and his colleagues had made for her, the 3 happy spacemen. Stefan at this time had been going over the records of their travels, adding them to their total report of the experiment. While writing the report out, Stefan would overhear a proximity warning telling the crew that they were about to impact a massive object floating in space. Stefan would put down his tablet and runs out of the room, through the nearby corridor and to the bridge, where he sees what triggered the warning: a huge, round asteroid. Gavin climbs down the ladder to the bridge and hops into the nearby chair. As he plants his hands on the wheel, he activates the reverse boosters and turns the ship to the left, with the mass just barely missing the observation ship. Thinking that they had just missed a catastrophic disaster, the 2 cheer and applaud themselves when Dennis would walk into the bridge to see what the commotion had originated from. The 2 would begin to explain what the situation had been, when Dennis would remark about a part of the asteroid being shiny. That's when Gavin and Stefan would begin to see at first a twinkle, and then on close inspection it would turn into a blinking in the dark exterior of the ship. Stefan would volunteer to enter the airlock in order to find out what is on that rock. Gavin would exhale before saying, "Alright, let's do it." The ship would begin to slowly turn back to the right, swinging back to the mass of the rock and cold soil. In the time it took for the ship to lock back on course with the ball in space, Stefan had managed to put on his spacesuit so he would be ready to traverse the space outside the ship. As Gavin parked the ship next to the asteroid, while allowing the ship to drift with the mass, he would give the green light to Stefan that it was now safe-ish to activate the seal of the airlock. After taking a breath within the helmet, Stefan would pull the switch to open the airlock. With the slats of the locking mechanism peeling away, Stefan would begin to feel the air being pulled out of the room as it was being sucked. Stefan was fearful of getting a sudden puncture of his suit or even getting his helmet cracked. Any little mistake could cost him his life. With the pressure of the cold, dead space around him choking him to death, he would snap out of his trance to see that the mass was right in front of him. He would let go of the lever and begin his movement towards the asteroid. As soon as he had landed, he would see the smoothness of the asteroid, which perplexed him. Curious, he had never have seen a massive object in space with such a smooth surface. It was almost like someone had sanded down the mass. However, he would soon see edge marks in the rock. He began to think that these marks, they couldn't have been a natural formation. He would normally see these marks to be left by miners, who would make short work of masses like these. Gavin would see Stefan just looking at the ground, closely inspecting the marked lines. He would radio to Stefan, asking him why he had stopped. What was wrong? He would radio back to Gavin, telling him of the edge marks, that these couldn't have formed over time. Someone must have cut or sliced these into the massive rock. Gavin would tell him to move on in the interest of time, and they will discuss it later. Gavin, gripping the soil in his hand, would pull himself up slowly as to not push himself away from the asteroid, bobbing up and down over and over again, moving further and further along the asteroid, seeing the flash on the horizon, with it brightening and dimming over and over. As Gavin looked over the side of the asteroid, he would soon see something that he had not expected to find this far into deep space. A distress beacon. Gavin would rub the side of the device to see the letters that spell out CEC. The crew of 2 would take the distress beacon to the workshop where they would deal with the computer diagnostics. The 2 would carry the device and slowly place it on the table next to the computer before hooking it up with several wires so that they could decipher the data stream in order to find the origin of the beacon. Dennis would walk into the room and help in the task before the computer would announce that an audio log had been activated. Stefan would begin looking through the long list of procedures in order to deal with the discovery of a distress beacon, where Dennis would dismiss the manual and tells him to locate the origin of the beacon. He would turn to Gavin, asking him to pull up the flight plan from Manifest, and he would return the order with a reply that the plan had been coming up now, where he reads out Ishimura Planet Cracker, First Class, Sector, Rhesus 4 Niner Mark 278 Point on 7 Mine on System. Dennis would input the coordinates into the computer, and they would wait to see the scan going through. However, once it came back with nothing, Dennis would ask again to see if Gavin was sure something or someone was within the restricted sector. He would confirm to Dennis that, of course, he was sure, and tells him to scan it again, which he soon does so. Dennis, however, would be vigilant, and Gavin would roll his eyes, telling the pair to trace the beacon's journey. However, Stefan would interject, telling him that could take hours, time that they did not have. Dennis would actually in fact begin the procedure anyway, and they prepared to trace the origin point of the beacon. Gavin would then think about calling Control to seek their advice about the development, and advises that maybe they should just do that, telling the pair about this, when all of a sudden the computer completes the trace, which shocks the crew. Dennis begins to grow suspicious of the hardware, stating that it could not have completed the task that quick, that was impossible, unless they were very close to the Ishimura. They would begin to ask themselves what a planet cracker would be doing in deep space, when they can see the computer showing them the location of the ship, the Aegis cluster. Stefan would state that they couldn't be there, as the Aegis system was a deeply prohibited space, and turns to Gavin to see that he had turned cold, and his face, it looked pale, which forced him to remark that it looked as if he had seen a ghost. Dennis would remark on the excitement as he leans back in his chair, but Stefan wouldn't be eager to jest, stating that if all of this was true, then the Ishimura has just about broken 20 interspace laws, ranging from federal to local, all the way to military. Dennis would look again, and it would come back with a perfect scan, confirming what they had seen prior. Dennis would then ask Gavin to hail the Ishimura. However, there was no reply, just the eerie silence, forcing Dennis to turn around to see that he was just standing there, staring out towards the screen, like he had been caught up in a trance. Dennis would ask again to hail the Ishimura, when Gavin would suddenly respond this time, sounding as if he had just woken up from a full sleep cycle. Dennis would see that he continued to stand there, doing nothing, with his eyes rolling from side to side. This would frustrate him, so he continues to tell him that he knows the routine, and orders him to get his comlink on, when Gavin tells the pair that he needs to go, and so he begins to turn in a very zombie-like motion and walks out of the room and down the hall. In complete disbelief of the refusal, he would then order Stefan to hail the planet cracker, and he would comply with the order, unlike Gavin, who had made it to a nearby room where he begins to contact his boss, Commander Chang, to bring the recent development to light. As the call goes through, Gavin would see a ping on his interface. It had been his wife, telling him that his daughter misses him, and she would ask for the transmission that he had promised to send her. When the call would connect, and Gavin would then see the commander standing before him, he would ask what the interruption had been about. Gavin would explain what they had been doing, what they had discovered, and the location of the USG Ishimura, still with the grim, pale expression that he had before. Commander Chang would look as if he wasn't surprised, but would inform Gavin that they had already sent a warship to the system, but there was something further to be done from his side, something that he would need to do for their arrival, to execute Eventuality 117. Suddenly, Gavin would snap out of this trance and asks if that is necessary. The commander would look back at him, displeased with the sudden refusal. He then begins to curl a smile out. When he would ask about Gavin's family, Gavin wouldn't answer, thinking to himself that it was strange for a question to be issued out in this long-range briefing session. The commander would say to him that he shouldn't mind the question, that he already knew the answer. It would be a shame for something to happen to such a pretty little girl, and such a fine specimen for his wife. Shocked by what the commander had been implying, he would begin to feel himself being backed into a corner, with the commander repeating the order that they should be on the same page now. Gavin is to execute Eventuality 117, to kill the rest of the crew, and to await for the warship to arrive. Gavin would walk out of the room and turns to the kitchen, overhearing the failed attempts to get into contact with the Ishimura, feeling his throat beginning to bulge, with his thoughts going back to his family, what their outcome would be if he was to refuse the order, and asking himself, could he really do it? But then again, what choice would he have? As he enters the kitchen unit, he then sees a knife. As he begins picking it up, sliding it out of the rack, he can see his reflection in it. As he stares at himself, he begins thinking about how he is to conduct the order, and begins to come up with a plan of action while sobbing to himself. Unable to contact the Ishimura at this time, Dennis would then look towards the audio log stored within the beacon. Even though the computer had stated before that it had been activated, the data was scrambled, and it needed to be archived in order to hear the contents for themselves. Stefan would tell Dennis to leave the workshop so that he can get some more rest before his next shift, and that he has got this. Stefan would tell him that he would notify him of any news of the log. Dennis would issue a nod before walking out of the doorway and back towards the crew quarters. Dennis would be thinking of Gavin, thinking of how weird he had been acting back there, almost like he had been triggered by the mere thought of the Aegis cluster. As he walked into the crew quarters, he then saw a recording of the video that the 3 crew members had made to send to Gavin's daughter, Sally, when he would feel a sudden jolt and a pain in his back, with the air in his lungs escaping him as he tried to catch it. He would turn to face the pain, but what he saw, he just couldn't believe. It had been Gavin, looking quite upset, with a frown on his face and tears forming in his eyes. Gavin would rip the knife from Dennis's back and begins to stab him over and over again, until hearing Dennis's final breath escape his lungs, and his body fell limp. A moment prior to the attack, however, Stefan had come up with a sudden development. A new signal had emerged in their area, and he would rush to Dennis in order to tell him of this, when he would hear several ominous sounds echoing out from the crew quarters. He begins walking towards it, as if somebody had been cutting something, cutting meat, like somebody was preparing a meal in the kitchen, when he would see someone hunched over, sitting in a puddle of a crimson color. As Gavin had finished the kill, he would hear a gasp coming from the corridor. Stefan would then see Gavin slowly turn to meet his gaze. Once Stefan's mind had put the images he had been seeing together, he would turn around and bolt towards the other door, with Gavin in hot pursuit. He ran straight down the corridor, hearing the loud footsteps rushing towards him. He would turn the corner and out of the other room, hearing Gavin had entered the previous room. Stefan would hit a switch on the wall next to him, which would seal the room, with Gavin still inside. Seeing the danger was over with the banging on the door coming from Gavin, with him pleading with him to open the door, that this must be done for the good of his own family. Unsure of what he had meant by these pleads, he would ignore him and rushes back to Dennis, where Stefan could see the damage that Gavin had issued out. Stefan would then hold Dennis up, thinking that there must have been something he could have done to prevent this. He carries Dennis to a nearby chair and positions him as best as he could, but the corpse would slump over to the side anyway. To preserve his life, he would lock himself in with Dennis, unaware that Gavin had studied the ship's layout, and there had been another way to gain access to the crew quarters. That's when he would hear several banging and clanging sounds coming from all around him, until he heard a noise coming from above him. Then he saw it, a dark, shadowy figure climbing out of a hatch, holding a knife, with blood still dripping down from it. It had been Gavin, and he had found Stefan once again. However, he would tell Stefan that he wouldn't make him suffer, that he just needed him to die. Stefan replies to the madness now gripping Gavin, telling him that they used to be friends. Gavin would reply to this attempt at tugging on his sanity with the fact that he didn't want this. He didn't want to do this, but he had no choice. The order must be fulfilled. Gavin would now be ready to make his second kill of the day as he dropped down and began to swing the knife in all directions. He would go in for a lunge, but Stefan would dodge the sudden attack. Instead, Gavin would smash a computer screen, with his hand going straight through the monitor, giving Stefan one last chance at redeeming Gavin's soul and saving his own. Gavin ripped his hand out from the monitor, and in doing so, he would gain the knife back at his side. He would see Stefan with his back turned to him, so he would rush to him before Stefan turns to meet his murderous rampage. Gavin would stop in his tracks when seeing that Stefan had been holding something in his hand over his head. He then looked to see the picture of his family, with Gavin and his wife holding their daughter in their embrace, forcing Gavin to weep, and he would soon fall to the floor in front of Stefan. Stefan would begin to walk away, slowly thinking that Gavin had been brought back to reality, when he suddenly felt a sharp and immense pain in the back of his leg, and he would fall to the floor. He then felt himself being pulled across the floor slats, and when he had stopped, he would look up to see Dennis slumped on the chair above him, before Gavin stabs him repeatedly until Stefan slips into the darkness, with it enveloping his soul. No. The job, the order, Eventuality 117, had been finished, but there was still one more soul on board. Suddenly, a ringing could be heard. Gavin would turn to see the two members of his crew bloodied and dead in front of him. He would begin feeling the guilt rushing towards him, gripping his heart like a vice. All of this just to secure his family's future. He would walk towards the origin of the ringing, thinking on what his family would say to him if they could see him, but they couldn't, and they wouldn't. He accepts the transmission, with a soldier wearing an advanced military rig appearing on the other side. Asking if the order had been completed, Gavin would say to him that it had been done. The soldier would then give him another order, ordering him to await for a boarding party to clean up the mess he had made. Sweating from the sheer discomfort of what he had become, to save his loved ones, he would begin to walk away from the transmission. The The soldier would see this and begins ordering him to return to the screen, and Gavin would shout, "No." The soldier would repeat the order over and over again, telling him to return at once, but all that could be heard in the ship would be the mechanical noise of the airlock opening, with Gavin opening the exterior side without a spacesuit. The warnings would blare out. Decompression was imminent, and soon he felt as the air around him had been sucked out in a matter of seconds. His ears began popping immensely, and he would suffocate as he slipped into the dead space.
Commander Cadigan, all targets have been eliminated. Proceeding to Operation White Light. Aegis System, Planet Pending. Objective, Deep Cleanse. CEC vessel USG Ishimura in breach of government order. Proceeding to Rendezvous Point.